Hello everybody, welcome back to another light novel review. This time I am talking about volume number 4 of Ryohgo Narita's light novel series, Durarara. Now in this volume we have our headless or bicycle rider or motorbike rider, Celti. The whole thing starts off with her pretty happy with herself because she's just gotten herself a fat wad of cash, and she thinks to herself that she's going to do something really, special for herself and for her boyfriend. And then she gets involved in some stuff and loses the money. What no one really seems to realize is that this is going to set in motion a series of events that are going to result in a hired assassin, a serial killer, and a whole bunch of biker gangs all colliding on a crazy, violent collision in Ikebukuro. This novel, again, it's just another one of those great volumes that Ryohgo Narita delivers. I say it every single time, he is the master of taking all of these events that he chains together, that eventually they all sort of coalesce into this almost fate-like single story at the end. It's much more of a challenging series than a lot of the other light novels that are out in English right now. He jumps around in time a lot by the very nature of the fact that he's teasing you with things. So he'll show you an event, and then halfway through the book, he'll revisit just before that event to show you what led up to it. And then later on in the book, he'll show you what happened just after that event that led to events that you just read about like 4 chapters ago. It jumps all over the place. It is not a straight linear narrative like probably the vast majority of other light novels that we have. And the other thing that makes this series great is that he continues to populate it with amazing, weird, and strange characters that are real enough in the fact that they fit into this world and this story. But at the same time, there's times where I scratch my head and I'm like, how did he even think of a human being who operates this way? So it's populated with a lot of great characters. There's a couple of new characters that are added into this volume, as well as we have a couple of sort of side characters that have been mentioned or briefly appeared in previous volumes that are much more prominent in this one. It delivers on what he said in volume number 3 when he sort of said that was the end of the arc with sort of the dollars, and that this book would focus a lot more on Celti and sort of how all of these different kind of events within Ikebukuro, how they seem to sort of start revolving around her, and it's almost like her supernatural presence in the city just seems to beckon to these strange and odd events. And that's exactly what happens in this book, which is great because, again, and I know I've said this in some of my previous reviews for Durarara, this series has sort of 2 very central narratives to it. And the main one, I think, is the whole idea of monsters. What makes a monster? And quite often you have all sorts of different characters in this book referring either to themselves or to others as monsters. And they're pretty much all for different reasons, and yet all of those reasons seem to be correct. They fit our terminology of monster. But what's ironic is that probably the most monstrous character in the whole book, which is the headless motorbike rider, at her core, morally, is probably one of the most human and humane characters in the entire series. So I love this little sort of play on things that he does. The other thing that I really enjoy is that we have Celti, who is a character that is completely created by shadow. I mean, she has a physical form, but the vast majority of her powers, the vast majority of like her clothing, her weapon, even her motorbike to a certain extent, all of these things are formed from shadow. So we have a character who herself is almost entirely shadow, and yet she exists out there in the open. And much to her at times detriment, particularly in this volume, but she lives out in the world. She is a visible thing. And yet we have so many human characters in this book that are the exact opposite. They're human, and yet they exist in the shadows. They act from the shadows. Most of our villains in this series manipulate things from the shadows as opposed to being out in the open, and yet there is this monster, this living shadow that's out in the open. So it's one of those sort of things that play around in this series, this idea of inverting sort of our typical expectations. You know, humans are more monstrous than the monster. The shadow is more actually visible and out of the shadows than the human beings. Another idea that he explores in this book is that Ikebukuro itself is perhaps the main character. I mean, that's sort of my interpretation of it. I know that Narita has said himself that it's Celti who's the main character, but really in this book, he totally plays that idea that these individuals, and in a sense, by extrapolation, we could say all of us as individuals, that all of us are the living story and culture and brain network of our individual communities, and that a city really only exists as a cultural, only has an identity because of the individuals within it. And that seems to be sort of the fun thing, and why Narita continues to populate Ikebukuro with all these interesting and sort of urban mythic type characters, because that is exactly what they're sort of contributing to the idea of this city and what the city's identity is. In terms of like an overall series, definitely volumes number 1 to 3 were a arc. It was the story of the dollars and how they sort of came to more prominence and eventually kind of shifted back into the shadows and the background. This book, it feels more like a calm in the storm. So it feels more like a taking a snapshot of our characters in a, well, as normal a day as ever happens in this particular city. But it's, you know, the gang conflicts are basically over. The whole, you know, Night of the Slasher, like all the events from the first 3 books are in the past. People obviously still think of them. They're still mentioned to a certain extent, but this is now that sort of moment of peace after it. And you can tell as you read the book and as you go through some of the events, you can tell that this is also the piece before an even bigger explosion occurs within this series. So this book is in the series of Durarara so far. I mean, as so far as I can tell. This is sort of a bit of a moment to collect yourselves, to get to know some of the other characters a little bit better, get to know a few new characters who I am sure are going to contribute in some very interesting ways to the future stories of Durarara, and to begin setting up some of the characters and some of the events that are going to set the series into another large arc and even more action and adventure for our characters. So those are my thoughts on volume number 4 of Durarara. My next review is going to be on volume number 2 of The Irregular at Magic High School. So this will be volume number 2, which is also part 2 of the enrollment arc. So that'll be my next review. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to click that subscribe button so you can keep up with all my future light novel reviews, including this one next week. If you want to check out my old reviews, I've got a link to that as well as to my manga reviews. And I don't just read books, I also write them when I get a chance. I've got links to those as well up above. Thank you so much for watching this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Until then, bye-bye for now.